My parents said that I was an unplanned child, but with my brother, the golden child, they treated him differently. After that, they kicked me out of the house. I grew up in a family that most people would call dysfunctional. My parents, Linda and Thomas, fancied themselves as artists. They weren't successful, but they lived in the delusion that their work would eventually be recognized as genius. Art came before everything else, including me. From as early as I can remember, I felt like an afterthought, constantly reminded that I wasn't part of their plan. My mom had no problem saying it outright. "You came into our lives at the worst possible time." My dad wasn't as vocal, but his indifference spoke volumes. Things got worse when my younger brother Andy was born. He was 5 years younger than me, and from the moment he arrived, he was treated like a gift from the heavens. Suddenly, my parents became the doting, attentive mom and dad I had always wished for, but only to Andy. I was shoved to the side, a shadow in my own family. If Andy cried, I was somehow to blame. If I didn't help enough around the house, I was selfish. If I tried to speak up, I was being dramatic. They saw perfection in him and flaws in me. School became my refuge. I was good at it, and I poured myself into academics and creative writing. I entered contests and worked hard, hoping it might make my parents notice me. When I won a statewide essay competition and a $500 prize, I thought it might be the moment they'd finally be proud of me. I showed my mom the certificate, and she barely looked at it. "That's nice," she said. "Put it on the fridge." I was crushed. No congratulations, no excitement, just indifference. Meanwhile, Andy's crude crayon drawings were treated like masterpieces. My parents converted part of the garage into an art studio just for him and started organizing little exhibitions for their friends and neighbors to admire his talent. It was humiliating. I once tried to show one of my short stories to my mom during one of Andy's art shows. She didn't even look up. "Don't interrupt," she said. "This is Andy's moment." Birthdays were another glaring example of how differently we were treated. On my 10th birthday, I got $50 in an envelope and a store-bought cake. It wasn't much, but I was grateful. Then Andy's 5th birthday came along, and they threw a huge party with a magician, catered food, and decorations everywhere. They bought him a brand new bike and made sure everyone knew how special he was. I sat in the corner of the party, fighting back tears, feeling completely invisible. By the time I was in high school, I stopped expecting anything from my parents. They never came to my debate competitions, school plays, or even my graduation. I begged them to come to one of my drama performances, but my mom said she was too busy, and my dad muttered something about being tired. Meanwhile, they attended every single one of Andy's art events. It didn't matter if it was just a tiny school function. They were there, front and center, beaming with pride. I overheard my mom talking one night. She was telling my dad how Andy was destined for greatness, how he'd be their legacy. Then she said, "Jessica will be fine. She's tough. She doesn't need us like Andy does." Hearing that didn't make me cry. It didn't even make me angry. I just felt numb, like any hope of being valued had been drained from me. At some point, I realized the only way I'd ever escape their shadow was to leave home. I got a part-time job and started saving up for college. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, was the first adult who ever truly believed in me. She encouraged me to apply for scholarships and even helped me with the applications. With her support, I managed to secure enough funding to attend a state university. The day I left for college was bittersweet. My mom gave me a weak hug. My dad didn't even look up from his newspaper, and Andy was busy painting another masterpiece. As I loaded my suitcases into the car, I felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. I was leaving behind everything I'd ever known, but for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. I don't know if sharing all of this will make anyone feel any different about their own family struggles, but writing it all down has been oddly freeing. There's so much more to this story, and if anyone's interested, I'll share more later. It's exhausting to relive it all, but maybe it's worth putting out there if it helps even one person feel less alone. Thanks for reading. When I graduated high school at 19, I didn't feel much pride or excitement. If anything, I felt relief. Relief that I had made it through, and that I might finally move forward with my life. But deep down, I was still clinging to a sliver of hope that my parents might show some sign of care or even pride. That hope shattered the day my mom handed me an envelope at breakfast. It wasn't a congratulations card or anything sentimental. It was a formal letter, typed and printed, with my name at the top. I stared at it, confused, until my dad cleared his throat and told me to read it carefully. My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter, written in cold, detached language, informed me that I had 60 days to leave the house. They claimed it was time for me to spread my wings and embrace independence. "We believe this will be a good life lesson for you," my mom said, sipping her coffee like she hadn't just handed me a notice to vacate. "What about Andy?" I asked, my voice breaking. He was 14 at the time and had never lifted a finger around the house. Why isn't he being asked to embrace independence? My dad looked at me like I'd asked the stupidest question in the world. "Andy is different. He has potential, and he still needs our support. You're older. You'll figure it out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were kicking me out, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because they didn't want to deal with me anymore. Andy, of course, got to stay. He didn't have chores, responsibilities, or expectations. He was their golden child, and I was the inconvenience they were finally getting rid of. I spent the next few weeks scrambling to figure out my next steps. I was working part-time at a bookstore, but my paycheck barely covered groceries, let alone rent. Every apartment I looked at required a $2,000 deposit, which might as well have been $1 million to me. I tried asking my parents for help, but my mom just laughed. "Jessica, this is part of growing up," she said. "We can't hold your hand forever." The worst part was how smug Andy seemed about the whole thing. He'd walk around the house like he owned it, making snide comments about how tough I was supposed to be. One night, I overheard him telling his friend on the phone that he couldn't wait to turn my room into his new studio. I wanted to scream at him, but what was the point? My parents would just take his side, like always. With less than 2 weeks left before my deadline, I was desperate. I tried staying with a friend from high school, but her parents were strict and didn't want another person in the house. I considered sleeping in my car, but I didn't even have enough gas money to drive around and look for safe places to park. Finally, someone at work told me about a women's shelter downtown. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. When I arrived at the shelter, I was terrified. The building was old and run down, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Hope House. I stood outside for what felt like an eternity, clutching my backpack and wondering if this was really my life now. Finally, I took a deep breath and walked inside. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Marcy, greeted me with a tired but kind smile. "First time here?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She handed me a clipboard with a stack of forms to fill out and told me to wait in the lobby. The room was small and crowded, with women of all ages sitting on mismatched chairs. Some looked just as scared as I felt. Others seemed resigned, like they'd been there forever. After what felt like hours, Marcy led me to my room. It was tiny, with 2 bunk beds and a single window that barely let in any light. I'd be sharing the space with 4 other women. One of them, a young woman named Rachel, introduced herself right away. She was probably in her early 20s, with messy blonde hair and a warm smile. "Welcome to the party," she said, trying to lighten the mood. The others were less talkative. There was Beatrice, an older woman who mostly kept to herself, Tanya, who was always on her phone, and Maria, who barely spoke English but tried her best to communicate with hand gestures and smiles. It was cramped and noisy, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely alone. Living in the shelter was hard. The bathrooms were shared, the food was bland, and there was little privacy. But it was also the first time I experienced real kindness. Rachel, for all her sarcasm, had a heart of gold. She showed me how to navigate the shelter's unwritten rules and even shared her tips for job hunting. Beatrice surprised me one day by slipping a granola bar into my bag when she noticed I hadn't eaten. Little gestures like that kept me going. One night, Rachel and I stayed up late talking. She told me about her abusive ex and how she'd ended up at the shelter after he drained her bank account. In turn, I told her about my parents and how they'd practically pushed me out the door. "That's messed up," she said, shaking her head. "Parents are supposed to have your back, not kick you when you're down." Hearing someone validate my feelings was a revelation. For so long, I'd been made to feel like I was the problem, like I deserved the way my parents treated me. But Rachel made me see that wasn't true. She and the other women at the shelter weren't perfect, but they were kind, and that kindness meant everything to me. One day, Marcy called me into her office and handed me a flyer for a program that helped young women transition out of shelters. They offered job placement assistance and subsidized housing. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a start. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could build a life for myself without my parents' help or their judgment. After a few grueling months at the shelter, a fleeting memory of my Aunt Sandra came to mind. My mother had mentioned her a few times in the past, but not kindly. She'd once called Sandra too pragmatic and claimed she had no imagination or soul because she had chosen a stable, traditional career in finance instead of pursuing artistic passions like my parents. At the time, I had dismissed the comments, but now, it struck me that Sandra might be exactly the kind of person who could help me. Digging through an old box of keepsakes, I found a piece of paper with her number written on it. I hesitated before dialing. What if she was just as dismissive as my parents? But desperation won out, and I made the call. To my surprise, Sandra answered almost immediately. When I explained my situation, her voice softened. "Jessica," she said, "why didn't you call me sooner? I'll be there as soon as I can." True to her word, Sandra arrived just a few days later. She drove over 800 kilometers to pick me up, pulling up to the shelter in a clean but modest SUV. I remember feeling a wave of relief when I saw her. Sandra was nothing like my mother had described. She was a tall, composed woman in her late 40s with a sharp sense of practicality, but her warm smile and kind eyes made it clear she wasn't cold or unfeeling. She hugged me tightly, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone truly cared. The drive back to her home was long, but Sandra kept the conversation light, asking about my interests and plans for the future. She didn't pry or lecture, which I appreciated more than I could say. Her house, a cozy 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood, felt like a sanctuary compared to the chaos I'd grown up in. She showed me to a small but comfortable guest room, complete with a neatly made bed, fresh towels, and even a stack of books she thought I might like. "You're safe here," she said. "Take all the time you need to get back on your feet." Living with Sandra was like stepping into an entirely different world. She was meticulous but never controlling, and she encouraged me to focus on rebuilding my life. She helped me create a budget and taught me the basics of financial literacy, concepts like saving, investing, and avoiding debt. "These are things everyone should know," she said, but unfortunately, not everyone is taught. I got a job at a local bookstore, earning $17 an hour, which felt like a fortune compared to what I was used to. The work was steady and fulfilling, and my coworkers were friendly and supportive. Sandra also encouraged me to enroll in community college, offering to cover my tuition until I could save enough to pay for it myself. For the first time, I felt like I had a future that wasn't dictated by my parents' neglect or favoritism. One of the most surprising things about living with Sandra was how much she encouraged me to explore my interests. She never dismissed my love for writing or suggested it was impractical. Instead, she helped me find ways to integrate it into my studies, suggesting courses in journalism and creative writing. Her belief in me was something I hadn't experienced before, and it gave me the courage to dream bigger than I ever had. Things were finally starting to stabilize when my parents resurfaced. I hadn't heard from them since they'd kicked me out, so their sudden interest in my life was jarring. They called me out of the blue, claiming they wanted to reconnect. At first, I thought they might have changed, but their true motives became clear within minutes. They were in serious financial trouble, more than $50,000 in debt, and they wanted my help. "We're a family," my mom said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to stick together in tough times." I couldn't believe their audacity. They hadn't cared about me when I was struggling, yet now they expected me to bail them out. I refused, and their masks slipped almost instantly. My dad accused me of being ungrateful, while my mom launched into a tirade about how much they'd sacrificed for me. It was the same old manipulation, but this time, I didn't fall for it. I hung up the phone, shaking with anger, but also feeling a newfound sense of strength. A week later, I came home from work to find Sandra waiting for me with a grim expression. She handed me a letter that had been slipped under the door. It was from my parents, and it was anything but friendly. They were threatening to visit if I didn't reconsider helping them. I wasn't sure what they meant by that, but Sandra wasn't taking any chances. She installed new locks on the doors and security cameras around the house, just in case. Sure enough, they showed up a few days later. I was at work, but Sandra called me in a panic. My parents had tried to force their way into the house, claiming they had a right to stay there because I was their daughter. Sandra, ever the pragmatist, calmly called the police. By the time I got home, they were being escorted off the property. Watching them argue with the officers, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and, oddly enough, relief. For the first time, I realized I didn't owe them anything. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love and approval, but I finally understood that their treatment of me wasn't my fault. It was their failure, not mine. After that incident, I made the decision to go no contact with them. It wasn't easy, but Sandra supported me every step of the way. She reminded me that setting boundaries wasn't selfish. It was necessary for my well-being. With her help, I started to focus on my future rather than my past. I saved enough money to move into my own apartment, continued my studies, and even started submitting my writing to local publications. After cutting ties with my parents, I thought I'd left everything about them behind, including my brother, Andy. It wasn't an easy decision, but after the incident where they tried to force their way into Sandra's home, I realized I couldn't keep inviting their toxicity into my life. For years, I'd viewed Andy as an extension of them, a golden child who benefited from their favoritism while I suffered in the shadows. So, when he called me out of the blue one afternoon, I was hesitant to answer. "Jess?" His voice cracked through the receiver, unsure and shaky. "It's me, Andy." I froze, gripping the phone tightly. His voice, now deeper than I remembered, carried an undertone of vulnerability I hadn't expected. I considered hanging up, but something stopped me. I took a deep breath. "Andy, what's going on?" There was a long pause, and then he broke down. "I don't know who else to talk to," he confessed, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Mom and Dad are forcing me to quit school. They say I need to help them sell their artwork online, but I don't want to. I hate it, Jessica. They're controlling everything I do, and I don't know how to get out." The flood of emotions his words triggered nearly knocked me over. For so long, I'd resented Andy for the way he'd been treated like royalty while I was cast aside. But now, hearing the desperation in his voice, I realized he was just as much a victim of their toxicity as I had been, just in a different way. "Andy," I said gently, "I'm so sorry you're going through this. But you have to understand something. You're the only one who can decide what kind of life you want to live. If you want to stay in school, you have to stand up for yourself." He sighed heavily. "That's easy for you to say. You're not here anymore. You don't have to deal with them every day." "I know it's hard," I said, my throat tightening, "but I'm here for you. If you need someone to talk to, I'll always answer your calls. But you have to make your own choices. You can't let them control you forever." There was another long pause, and then he mumbled, "Thanks, Jess. I'll figure something out." After we hung up, I couldn't stop thinking about him. For all the pain and resentment I'd carried toward Andy, I didn't want him to end up like our parents, bitter, manipulative, and trapped in a cycle of their own making. I resolved to keep the lines of communication open, even if it was difficult. Maybe, just maybe, I could help him find his way out. Meanwhile, my own life was slowly starting to take shape. My job at the bookstore had become more than just a paycheck. It was a place where I felt valued and supported. My boss, Sarah, was a vibrant, no-nonsense woman in her mid-30s who had a knack for spotting potential in people. She took me under her wing, teaching me the ins and outs of running a small business. She even encouraged me to take on more responsibilities, like organizing author events and managing inventory. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Jessica," she said one day as we unpacked a shipment of new releases. "I can see you running a place like this one day, if that's what you want." Her faith in me was both flattering and terrifying. No one had ever believed in my abilities like that before, not even me. But Sandra had been working hard to change that. Living with her was like a crash course in self-worth. She constantly reminded me that I was capable, deserving, and strong enough to build a future on my own terms. At Sandra's urging, I enrolled in night classes at the local college. Tuition was steep, $200 per semester, but with my bookstore job and Sandra's guidance on budgeting, I managed to scrape together enough to cover it. My classes were challenging, but I loved the feeling of expanding my mind and working toward a goal that was entirely mine. I gravitated toward courses in literature and creative writing, rediscovering the passion I'd buried for so long. Sandra continued to be my rock. She celebrated every milestone, no matter how small, from acing a quiz to finishing a particularly tough shift at work. She even started dropping little surprises into my life, like a new notebook for my writing or a pair of comfortable shoes for work. "You're investing in yourself," she'd say with a smile. "The least I can do is help." But not everything was smooth sailing. One night, as I was studying for an exam, I got another call from Andy. This time, he sounded calmer, but there was still a note of uncertainty in his voice. "I did it," he said quietly. "I told Mom and Dad I'm not quitting school." My heart swelled with pride. "Andy, that's amazing. How did they take it?" "Not well," he admitted. "Mom cried and said I was being ungrateful. Dad called me a failure. But I don't care. I'm staying with a friend for a while until I figure things out." Hearing him stand up for himself felt like a victory, not just for him, but for both of us. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same side, united in our determination to break free from our parents' toxic influence. As my relationship with Andy slowly mended, my life continued to move forward. Sarah offered me a raise at the bookstore, recognizing my hard work and dedication. I used the extra income to save for the future, setting aside money for a place of my own. At college, I started making friends with people who shared my love of books and writing, and for the first time, I felt a sense of belonging. One evening, as Sandra and I sat on the porch sipping tea, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Jessica," she said, "you've come a long way in such a short time. I'm proud of you." Her words brought tears to my eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said honestly. She shook her head. "I gave you a place to start, but you're the one who did the work. Never forget that." Her words stayed with me. Slowly but surely, I was building a life that was entirely mine, free from the shadows of my past. And for the first time, I believed I was capable of anything. The final chapter of my tangled relationship with my parents came unexpectedly, like a storm that suddenly breaks and leaves behind a strange, peaceful stillness. For months after they had tried to force their way into Sandra's home, I had braced myself for more attempts to manipulate or guilt me into returning to their lives. But to my surprise, things had been quiet. Too quiet. One afternoon, while I was shelving books at work, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was brief and formal, almost like a business memo. "We're leaving town. Moving to inherit a property from Aunt Martha. Thought you should know. Mom." I stood there in stunned silence, the book in my hand forgotten. Aunt Martha was a distant relative I barely remembered, but I vaguely recalled hearing she had passed away years ago, that they had inherited her house and decided to move there. Felt surreal. The address listed was in a small town more than 1,500 kilometers away, far enough that I wouldn't have to worry about bumping into them ever again. Later that evening, I called Sandra to tell her the news. She listened quietly as I explained, her voice calm but tinged with concern when she finally spoke. "How do you feel about it?" I hadn't considered that yet. Relief was my first instinct, but it wasn't that simple. My parents' departure wasn't just a geographical shift. It was the final, undeniable acknowledgement that whatever fragile ties we'd once had were now severed. For so long, I tried to make peace with the idea that they would never be the supportive, loving parents I'd needed. But this felt so final. "It's strange," I admitted. "I feel free, but I also feel empty. Like there's no going back now." Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "That's because there isn't. But that's not a bad thing, Jessica. It means your life is finally your own." The weeks that followed were oddly anticlimactic. My parents' departure was marked by nothing more than a single, curt phone call from my mother, informing me they'd left town. "We're settling in," she said flatly, as if we were casual acquaintances rather than family. I could hear my father in the background, grumbling about something, and I wondered if they'd finally started directing their frustrations at each other now that I was no longer around to blame. Their move didn't mean they were entirely out of my life, though. A few weeks after they left, I received a letter from them. It was handwritten, which surprised me, but the contents were exactly what I expected. A last-ditch attempt to stir up guilt. They wrote about how hard life had been for them, how the house they'd inherited was falling apart and they barely had the money to fix it. They didn't outright ask for help, but the implication was clear. I stared at the letter for a long time before folding it neatly and tucking it into a drawer. I didn't respond. I had nothing to say to them, and I wasn't going to let myself get pulled back into their toxic web. Sandra, ever the pragmatist, had a much simpler approach. "If they try to contact you again," she said, "block their number. You don't owe them anything, Jessica. Not after everything they put you through." Her words gave me the clarity I needed. For years, I had carried the weight of their judgment, their manipulation, their inability to love me unconditionally. Letting go of that burden felt like stepping out of a cage I hadn't realized I was trapped in. I started focusing entirely on my own life, my studies, my job, and the relationships that actually brought me joy. Around this time, my relationship with Andy also took a positive turn. He had managed to graduate high school, despite our parents' attempts to derail his education, and he had started working part-time at a local cafe. He called me regularly now, not to complain, but to share his small victories, getting a raise, learning to cook, making new friends. It was bittersweet to hear about his struggles and successes, knowing how much he'd been shaped by the same toxic upbringing as me. But I was proud of him for finding his way, even if it was harder than it should have been. One weekend, Andy came to visit me for the first time since we'd reconnected. He was quieter than I remembered, his once cocky demeanor replaced by a thoughtful, introspective air. Over dinner, he admitted something that caught me off guard. "I used to think you were the selfish one," he said, staring at his plate. Mom and Dad always made it seem like you were the problem. But now, I see it wasn't you. It was them. Hearing those words felt like a bomb on an old wound I'd stopped believing would ever heal. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I'm glad you see that now. And I'm glad you're here. That evening, we sat on Sandra's porch, talking late into the night. For the first time in years, I felt like we were truly siblings, connected not just by shared trauma, but by a mutual understanding of what it meant to survive it. With my parents out of the picture, my life began to take on a sense of stability I'd never experienced before. My job at the bookstore continued to grow into something more fulfilling than I'd ever imagined, thanks in no small part to Sarah's mentorship. She encouraged me to take on bigger responsibilities, like planning community events and managing the store's finances. At the same time, my night classes were going well. I was excelling in my creative writing courses, and one of my professors even suggested I submit a short story to a local literary magazine. I never thought my writing could be more than a personal outlet, but her encouragement made me believe it might have value beyond just me. Sandra was, as always, my greatest cheerleader. She celebrated every achievement, no matter how small, and constantly reminded me of how far I'd come. "You're building a life that's entirely yours," she said one evening as we cooked dinner together. "That's something to be proud of." Her words stayed with me. For so long, my life had been defined by what my parents wanted, or didn't want, for me. Now, for the first time, I was writing my own story, and it felt like a story worth living.